Today's topic is muscles. Unlike the heart and the lungs or the kidneys, muscles do not make a direct contribution to providing the right environment to different cells of the body in terms of the nourishment, the availability of oxygen, the removal of waste products, etc. But their indirect contribution is no less indispensable. An animal cannot survive unless it can move around to find food, to escape from an enemy, and to find a mate. And the same thing with small variations applies also to human beings. No society can support more than a limited number of paralyzed people, and that too imperfectly. So that is the importance of muscles, and that's why, in fact, around half the weight of our body is made up of muscles. With that little introduction, let me go to the slides. This session is a part of the S.03 course on health sciences and yoga, which, like the other activities of the YES project, is a part of the 150th birth anniversary of Sri Aurobindo and the 75th anniversary of India's independence. Let me start with expressing gratitude to the excellent book Principles of Anatomy and Physiology by Tortora, who has been the constant author through all editions. And in this edition, from which I have taken these pictures, has been joined by Grabowski. And in fact, for muscles, one cannot really get a good visual idea unless one has a look at those pictures, which give you an idea of how the muscles exactly look in the body. We have around 700 muscles in the body, and they contribute about 50% to the muscle mass. Here is a view of the skin and the other thin lining called the fascia removed, and you can see the muscles of the body. And this is the front view, this prominent chest muscle, the pectoralis major, and this rounded muscle that gives the rounded contour to the shoulders, the deltoid, and then in the arm, the biceps in the front and the triceps at the back, and the prominent four muscles which constitute the quadriceps femoris in the front of the thigh, and the hamstrings that are at the back of the thigh, and here is the kneecap, and then these muscles of the calf, and particularly this one at the back, this fat muscle, the gastrocnemius, and then this prominent tendon which we can all feel at the back of the heel, the Achilles tendon, which we shall talk about again a little later. So this is the view of the muscles as a whole. Now let's come to muscles in one part of the body at a time. These are the muscles of the arm, the upper arm, and we can see towards the front the biceps muscle, the muscle that becomes prominent when we flex the forearm, when we take the forearm towards the upper arm. And behind that is the triceps. They're called biceps and triceps because of the number of heads, as it is called, which together constitute that muscle. For example, here you can see in case of the biceps, these are two tendons at two separate points attached to two different points on the shoulder blade. And these two then fuse into one eventually and join to form a single attachment with the ulna, the bone in the forearm. The same way the triceps has three heads like that. And that's why these bi and tri. Now this shows the muscles of the forearm and the hand. And in the forearm, the most prominent muscle is the brachioradialis. And in the hands, the most prominent muscle is the brachioradialis, and in the hands, the most prominent muscle is the brachioradialis, and in the femoral artery, the most prominent muscle is the brachioradialis, and in the femoral artery, the most prominent muscle is the brachioradialis, and in the femoral artery, the most prominent muscle is the brachioradialis, and in the femoral artery, the most prominent muscle is the brachioradialis, and in the femoral artery, the most prominent muscle is the brachioradialis, and in the femoral artery, the most prominent muscle is the brachioradialis, and in the femoral artery, the most prominent muscle is the brachioradialis, and in the femoral artery, the most prominent muscle is the brachioradialis, and in the femoral artery, the most prominent muscle is the brachioradialis, and in the femoral artery, the most prominent muscle is the brachioradialis, and in the femoral artery, the most prominent muscle is the brachioradialis, and in the femoral artery, the most prominent muscle is the brachioradialis, and in the femoral artery, the most prominent muscle is the brachioradialis, and in Again, you can see the small, small muscles and the tendons. These are the muscles of the hand, and you can see how intricate is the musculature here to make all that intricate movement of the fingers and particularly the thumb possible. Now, these are the muscles of the head and the face. On the side here is the temporalis muscle, and that's why perhaps this region is called the temples. This is the muscle that get tense when one has a headache, and the commonest cause is mental stress. And therefore, if one has a headache, one can just lie down in shavasana and relax completely, both the body and the mind, and you find that the headache disappears within 10 minutes without any painkiller. This is the frontalis muscle, again, which is affected profoundly by stress, and that's how you get the creases in the forehead. Yeah. And this is the masseter muscle, which is used for chewing. Of course, there is a large number of muscles that participate in chewing, but this is the strongest of them all. And this is the zygomatic arch, or this bone cut here, which gives the cheeks their prominence. And this is a thin muscle, platysma, which gives a shape to the lower part of the chin and the neck. Now, these are the muscles of the eyes, which make it possible for us to move the eyes left and right, up and down, and diagonally. And these muscles are also exercised in some of the yogic practices for eye exercises. And it's important to keep them in good shape. Now, this is the superficial front view of the chest and the abdomen. This is that prominent pectoral muscle, and this is the muscle that gives the rounded contour to the shoulders, the deltoid muscle. And these are the recti. Rectus means straight because of their straight fibers here. And at the back, this prominent muscle is the latissimus dorsi. And this is another muscle, the uh, teres major. And this muscle and the pectoral muscle, this latissimus dorsi, and this pectoralis major, as it is called. The full name is pectoralis major. Go and attach at 3 points quite close to each other on the bone of the arm, the humerus. Why I'm telling you this is because the students are often asked, where are these 3 attached on the humerus? And medical students have a mnemonic to remember that. Latissimus dorsi is in the middle, and this teres major on the top, teres major and pectoralis major on either side of it. And so L for latissimus dorsi, L for lady, and the 2 majors, the pectoralis major and the teres major, the 2 majors on either side, lady between 2 majors. So latissimus dorsi is in the middle. Now, these are the muscles that participate in breathing. Here is the prominent dome-shaped diaphragm, which separates the chest from the abdomen. As it moves down, this bell-shaped, dome-shaped diaphragm, when the muscle contracts, naturally this concavity becomes less, it moves down, and that's what expands the chest. And when the chest expands, the pressure in the chest drops, and when the pressure drops, air from outside rushes into the lungs. And here you can see the muscles between the ribs, and therefore called intercostal. Costal refers to the ribs. Between the ribs, intercostal muscles, and there are 2 sets of them, the external ones and the internal ones, running diagonally in opposite directions. And that's what makes it possible to move the ribs up, which increases again the expands the uh, chest cavity and makes it possible for us to take air in. And here are the abdominal muscles that also participate in breathing, and forcefully contracting them throws the air out. And these are the muscles of the back, which make it possible for us to bend the back and move it in all types of directions, some of the major muscles of the back. And you can see a series of ligaments joining one vertebra to the other. A ligament joins one bone to another. A muscle also joins one bone to another across a joint, but the muscle can contract, ligaments don't contract. Ligaments only either stretch or relax. And they have great tensile strength, which means we can pull them very hard and still generally they don't break. But generally they don't break, but however, there is a limit. They can get injured if exposed to too much of stress. And that's why one can understand why in back pain, why in the back, particularly when has back pain, one should not bend forwards, because when one bends forward, these ligaments which attach one vertebra to the other, which join one vertebra to the other, these ligaments will get stretched. And we have one special one here joining the back of the head to the last cervical vertebra, last vertebra of the neck, ligamentum nuchae, the ligament of the neck. So this ligament, if we bend the head forwards, won't be stretched. Whereas when we take it back, it is relaxed. And therefore, taking it back is okay. Moving the head forwards, moving it down, will stretch this ligament. So it should not be done when one has pain in the neck. And in the same way, these ligaments will get stretched if we bend forwards, and therefore no forward bends when one has back pain. Bending backwards will relax these ligaments. So this is the superficial view of the front of the thigh, and the muscles have been cut to show all the muscles. This is the major muscle, the rectus femoris, but then along with it has three other companions here, and together they form the quadriceps femoris. Quadriceps, refers to four. So four muscles, and then this is the muscle that is running diagonal like this, the thin muscle, is the sartorius muscle. Sartorius because it can become more prominent in tailors who have to often sit on the floor cross-legged, and that's why called sartorius. Sartorial, is an adjective used for a dress. So sartorius muscle and the quadriceps, and the quadriceps tendon, the tendon of all these four muscles finally becomes one and is attached to the kneecap or the patella. And then this tendon continues down after traversing and attaching to the patella right up to the one of the bones of the leg, the tibia. So these are the muscles that, if they contract, one can understand, will lead to flexion at the hip joint when the thigh rises up or the thigh moves forwards. That is the type of movement this will give us. Whereas the muscles at the back, the hamstrings, uh, these hamstrings, they will make it possible. They cross two joints, the hip joint as well as the knee joint. And therefore, if we contract these muscles, one can understand at the hip joint, we'll get extension. That is, the thigh would move backwards. And here at the knee, the contraction of these same muscles will make the knee bend, that is, lead to flexion of the knee. So extension at the hip joint, flexion at the knee joint, uh, both these will be possible because of these muscles at the back of the thigh, the hamstrings. And why they are called hamstrings is because they have long tendons, and butchers, uh, those who sell ham, they used to hang the dead animals by these tendons, and that's why, and these long tendons are like strings, that's why hamstrings. So these hamstrings at the back And these are the muscles that get stretched when you know one takes the leg straight up, because when we take the leg straight up without bending the knee, we are st- s- stretching these muscles, and because we are performing the opposite type of movement. These muscles, they bring about the backward movement of the thigh. That is, they take it back, the extension at the knee. But we are performing, when we take the leg up while lying down on the back, we are taking the leg up. So when we take it up, we are stretching these muscles. And the knee, if we bend it, then again they may relax. But then if we keep the knee straight without bending it, because these muscles, when they contract, they flex the knee. So if we try not to bend the knee, then these muscles are being stretched at both ends. And that's what sometimes the physiotherapists use to find out how much of the flexibility has been restored, the straight leg raising test. And then we turn to the lower part of the leg. What is actually the leg? This is the thigh, and then below that, below the knee is the leg. If we turn to this part, uh, you have these muscles and the tendons going to the feet, and this is the from the side. You can see the fat gastrocnemius muscle and its tendon at the back. This tendon is called the calcaneal tendon because it attaches to the calcaneum, but more commonly it is known as the Achilles tendon. Achilles tendon because of a mythological tale in Greek mythology. Achilles was, when Achilles was a baby, his mother thought that if she dips him in a sacred river, the child will become immortal. So she dipped the child in the river, all right, but then she didn't want the child to drown. So she held the child at the heel, held the left heel of the child firmly, and then dipped the child. And the result was that the child became uh, very strong, but it remained vulnerable at the left heel. So one point of vulnerability was still left, and probably that's why finally he could die. So, there's always a way around, even when somebody gets a boon of invulnerability, of finding it, of it's being very difficult to be killed. The divine generally keeps something in reserve so that if necessary, the person can still be killed, person or the demon. Now, we have similar weak points in Ravan at the umbilicus and so on. So the weak point here in Achilles was the heel, and that happened because although the baby could be dipped entirely into the river, this part did not get wet because the baby's mother held it by the left heel. So in common language, we use the word Achilles heel for the weak point of a person, especially in a person who is otherwise very strong. Now, what we are talking about so far and what we generally think of when we talk of muscles are the skeletal muscles. Skeletal means those which are attached to the skeleton, the muscles attached to the bones. And these muscles are voluntary muscles, which means they can be contracted at will. We can decide when to contract them, in which group to contract, which muscles to contract. So these are voluntary muscles attached to the bones. And these are the skeletal muscles. And you can see that if we examine them under the microscope, they have these stripes. And that's why they're also called striated muscles or muscles with stripes. They are under the control of willpower. We can decide when to contract them, but that doesn't mean that they contract only when we will. There's also a reflex contraction of skeletal muscles. For example, if you step on a sharp object or on something very hot, the foot lifts itself up reflexly. We don't have to will it, it happens on its own. Or if you touch your finger, accidentally put your finger on a pin on the sharp point of a pin, the hand draws itself back reflexly. So we don't have to think about it. We don't have to will it. It happens automatically as a reflex. We'll talk more about these reflexes later, not today, but in a subsequent session. But uh, these muscles are under the control of willpower, but can contract reflexly without the intervention of the will. This is the another important category of muscles in the body, the cardiac muscle, the muscles of the heart. Now, like the skeletal muscles, they also are striped, but they are not under the control of willpower. Their contraction is autonomous. The heart keeps beating on its own. Its activity can be modified by the autonomic nervous system. It can be modulated, but the activity itself is not dependent upon the nerve supply or the willpower. And then you find that in the cardiac muscle, there are these junctions between individual muscle fibers. These are low resistance junctions. Low resistance to what? Low resistance to electricity. The passage of impulses in the muscles is electrical in nature. And then that translates into the mechanical contraction of the muscle. In case of the heart muscle, the resistance between adjacent cells is very low because of these low resistance junctions. And this one can understand why. It is because once the impulse has started in the atria or in the ventricles at one point, it should be able to spread quickly throughout the atria or throughout the ventricles so that the entire chamber, the atrium or the ventricle, and the atria and the ventricles of both sides, they contract simultaneously, and the entire chamber contracts at the same time. So it's for this quick transmission that uh, we have these low resistance junctions between the individual muscle fibers in the heart. However, uh, there is a point between the atria and the ventricles where instead of this, we have a high resistance junction, the atrioventricular node. And that is to make sure that the atria and the ventricles do not contract simultaneously. When the atria contract, the ventricles relax, and the atria relax, the ventricles contract. That becomes possible because of the delay at the atrioventricular node because of a high resistance. But when it comes to the two similar chambers, that is the two atria or the two ventricles, the impulse spreads quickly throughout the atria or throughout the ventricles because of these low resistance junctions. Then this is a cell from a smooth muscle. Smooth muscles, like the cardiac muscle, are also not under the control of willpower. And unlike the skeletal and the cardiac muscle, they do not have stripes. And that's why they are called smooth. Where do we find these smooth muscles? In the arteries, in the arterial wall, in the intestinal wall, in the wall of the stomach, in the urinary bladder. So, all these organs which have movement, which need movement for their function, but this movement is not under the control of willpower. So, that is where we find smooth muscle. But our focus today will be on skeletal muscle. Now, let's look at the structure of a muscle. Now, this is the bone to which the muscle is attached by a tendon. And then if we cut open this muscle, we find that it is made up of a large number of bundles or fascicles, as they are called. Now, here, one of the bundles within this circle has been further enlarged here. So, this is one bundle. Now, within this bundle, we find that we have a large number of these circles. They have been further enlarged to show that we have these muscle fibers. Now, a muscle fiber corresponds to a single cell. And unlike cells at other places in the body, a muscle fiber or a cell has a large number of nuclei. And further, we find that the cell itself shows these stripes, which the muscle as a whole also we saw to some extent shows. But these cells, they also show these stripes. And they show these stripes because within this muscle fiber, there are a large number of myofibrils, and these myofibrils have these stripes. And these stripes are arranged in such a way that the stripes of one fibril are at the same level as the stripes of another fibril, which means that they are in register. And that's why they can together give that striped appearance. So this is the muscle cell or the muscle fiber, which we saw also here. This is also a muscle fiber with a large number of nuclei and these stripes. And the stripes are because the myofibrils within the muscle cell, they have these stripes, and different myofibrils are in register with each other. Now, how about the myofibril itself? That itself has further within it smaller rounded structures, the myofilaments. The myofilaments are of two types, thick ones called myosin filaments and the thin ones, the actin filaments. So here this has been shown diagrammatically here, the muscle with the tendons, the whole muscle. The whole muscle is made up of a large number of muscle bundles, and each bundle has a large number of muscle fibers. And within the fiber, there are these myofibrils. And these myofibrils further have myofilaments, the thick ones, the myosin filaments, and the thin ones, the actin filaments. Erroneously, myosin and actin filaments are called contractile proteins. These proteins don't contract. The muscle contracts because of the rearrangement of these myofilaments. And as you can see here, what has happened is that these thin filaments have moved further in. It's because of the sliding of these thin filaments that now this space has become smaller. The distance between this line and this line has become less here because of the inward movement of these thin filaments, so that this gap here has become smaller. This entire region from here to here has become smaller, and that makes the muscle as a whole become smaller in length or to contract. We'll have a look at this again as we go along in greater detail. So let's see how does a muscle contract. Skeletal muscle contracts when told by its nerve to contract. That is, the nerve supplying the muscle has to be activated. And there's at least one nerve supplying each muscle, and each nerve has a large number of nerve fibers. And each nerve fiber starts as a cell in the spinal cord. Spinal cord, is a part of the central nervous system. The spinal cord is enclosed within the vertebral column or the spine. Now, if we cut the spinal cord across, it's not a perfect circle, and it has a shape something like this, with a region which has more of cells in the center and more of fibers at the periphery. Further, these nerve cells or neurons, which give rise to those fibers which come to skeletal muscles, they occupy a niche within this part of the spinal cord. Now, this is towards the front. So that's why sometimes it's called the anterior horn, and these cells are called the anterior horn cells. So these are in the front. And this is one single neuron shown here, one single nerve fiber, and there will be a large number of such nerve fibers within the nerve which supplies a skeletal muscle. But for simplicity, let's just look at what happens to this one nerve fiber coming from the spinal cord, which belongs to this cell, which is an extension of this cell within the spinal cord. When it enters the muscle, it divides into a few branches. And these branches supply individual muscle fibers or muscle cells. And the muscle fibers which it supplies are not concentrated at one point, they are scattered throughout the muscle. And at least one nerve, which means a large number of nerve fibers, supply this muscle, which means that all these will be supplying a large number of muscle fibers scattered throughout. Which means that even if one of these is activated, the contraction will affect the entire muscle. And therefore, one can understand that the larger the number of nerve fibers within the nerve which are excited, more will be the muscle fibers scattered throughout, which will contract, and stronger will be the contraction. So this is one of the ways in which the strength of the muscle contraction can be regulated. We'll come to that also again. But right now, let's just focus on this, that we have these nerve fibers entering the muscle. Each nerve fiber supplying a number of muscle fibers scattered throughout. And the muscle fibers, which are supplied by a single nerve fiber, they together constitute the motor unit. So this nerve cell, together with the fibers which are supplied by it, forms one motor unit. Now, the size of the motor unit would be determined by the number of muscle fibers it supplies. And some muscles have small motor units, some have large motor units. And since the strength of contraction depends upon the number of motor units that are activated, one can understand that these motor units are small. That is, each nerve fiber goes to a relatively small number of muscle fibers, and therefore it will take a large number of nerve fibers to go to all the muscle fibers. Here, the regulation of strength will be better. Whereas if one nerve fiber itself goes to a very large number of muscle fibers, and there are a smaller number of nerve fibers going to all the muscle fibers in the muscle put together, then the regulation of the activity will not be so fine. So that's what makes it possible for us to have fine movements in, say, the muscles of the hand or the muscles of the eyes, whereas the muscles of the belly or the uh, thigh do not have that type of fine regulation, because the muscles of the belly or the thigh have large motor units, whereas the muscles of the hands or fingers, and particularly the fingers and the eyes, have small motor units. So you can see that everything is very neatly arranged depending upon our requirements. Now let's take a closer look at this area. Which area? The point at which a nerve fiber joins a muscle fiber. This is called the neuromuscular junction, because a junction between the nerve fiber and the muscle. So neuromuscular junction. So this is the nerve fiber, and when it enters the muscle fiber, it expands into a large sac-like structure, or a balloon-like structure, or a button-like structure, whatever you may like to look at it as. So there's an expansion here. And corresponding to that, we find that in the cell membrane of the muscle cell, no, muscle fiber is a muscle cell. And in that, it has a cell membrane like all cells. Here, it throws itself up into folds to expand the surface area, as we have seen in many other parts of the body also. To increase the surface area, we have these folds. And then these are the myofilaments, the actin and the myosin filaments, the thick ones here and the thin ones here. And at this junction is called the Z line. From one Z line to the next on this side, and from one Z line to the next, is what constitutes one unit of contraction. We'll see that later, but now let's first concentrate on the junction between the nerve and the muscle. The impulses travel to the muscle through this nerve fiber in the form of electrical impulses. And when they reach this junction, what happens is that these small balloon-like structures, tiny balloon-like structures called vesicles, they start moving closer to this membrane of the nerve cell, which is close to the membrane of the muscle. So these vesicles start moving in this direction, and they release the chemical inside into this gap or cleft between the nerve fiber and the muscle fiber. Between the membrane of the nerve here and the membrane of the muscle here, there's a gap, this cleft, this space in which this chemical is released. This chemical is acetylcholine. So these balloons contain acetylcholine, and when the electrical impulse comes from here, these vesicles containing acetylcholine move closer to the membrane here, and they finally release their acetylcholine into this junction. You'll find that there are two different languages being used here, one being translated into another. The language of transmission of the nerve impulse along this nerve fiber is electrical, but the transmission from this nerve to the muscle is chemical in nature. Acetylcholine is a chemical. Now what happens? Once this acetylcholine has been released here, it leads to an electrical change in the muscle membrane, which means that once again there's a change of language. The chemical language is translated back into an electrical language. So from electrical to chemical and from chemical to once again electrical. So there is an electrical change, electrical activity along this, which can spread. Just as here it can spread along the nerve fiber, now it starts spreading along both sides on the membrane of the muscle cell. Now, as this electrical activity spreads, it further leads to chemical changes here, which lead to contraction. We shall see in a little greater detail in a moment, which means that once again there's a change of language from electrical to chemical, and that chemical change into a mechanical change, mechanical activity. So, third language being used, mechanical activity, which leads to contraction of the muscle. Now, here it is the same picture, but along with that, you find another picture which shows some details of this region. So, the electrical impulse has come here. Acetylcholine has been released in this gap. Acetylcholine has led to an electrical change in the muscle membrane, which is the sarcolemma. So, the sarcolemma is this membrane of the muscle cell. Now, one finds that it dips in at this particular point where the tips of these myosin or thick filaments are close to the tips of the thin filaments. So at this point, wherever there are these junctions, this cell membrane dips in the form of tubular structures, the T tubules, and this electrical change which has taken place here as a result of this release of this chemical, this electrical change or impulse travels along this membrane, which means electrical change goes deep in, very close to these myofilaments. And what does it do? There's another set of tubes which expand into these sac-like structures, cisterns, which contain calcium. So this electrical change leads to a release of calcium from here. So once again, a change of language from electrical to chemical. Calcium is a chemical that is released here. Now, what does this calcium do? This calcium leads to an interaction of the actin and the myosin filaments, the thick and the thin filaments, and that's what makes these actin filaments move. Now, how is it that calcium is needed for this interaction? Why don't they interact all the time? How is it that the muscle remains relaxed all the time unless this calcium is released here? That happens because these thin filaments, they have another protein associated with them, which is wound around them throughout like a coil, and that prevents the interaction between the thin filaments and the thick filaments. So this interaction is prevented by that protective, you can say, protein. And then there is yet one more protein which has an affinity for calcium, which can bind with calcium. So when calcium is released here, this protein changes the shape of this protein in such a way that now this interaction becomes possible. So it removes this inhibition by altering the shape of the protein. And that's how this interaction begins. And this interaction then leads to the sliding of these thin filaments inwards. So you can see this very delicate engineering here, and using basically three languages to achieve the mechanical result of contraction. So electrical impulse coming from here, releasing a chemical, electrical to chemical. Then chemical to electrical, here the electrical change. So this is the electrical change. This electrical to once again chemical, calcium releases. And this calcium uses yet one more language, which is pretty common in biological structures, and that is changing the shape of a protein. Change in the shape of the protein leads to a removal of the inhibition, which was there in a relaxed muscle, the inhibition which was preventing the interaction between these thick and the thin filaments. Once the inhibition has been removed, the interaction becomes possible and the filament moves in. So you can see at the submicroscopic level how much of engineering is possible. A tiny little electrical change, not enough to give us an electric shock, release of minute amounts of chemicals, and just the change of the shape of a protein. The protein molecule itself is a big molecule, but same time a very small molecule, very difficult to see even under an electron microscope. That type of a change in that tiny structure leading to this interaction, which makes these individual units smaller and finally makes the muscle as a whole contract, which becomes visible to us. This tiny movement in a large number of units becomes visible to us as the contraction of the muscle as a whole. Now, this shows the same thing enlarged. So, the electrical change traveling along the muscle membrane, dipping in to the muscle at these points, which have the junction between the thick and the thin filaments, and this electrical change leading to a release of calcium from these longitudinally, that's along the tubules running along the length of the muscle fiber. These are T tubule transverse, they are running across, so transverse. These are L tubules are longitudinal, running along the length of the muscle fiber. Here they balloon into these sac-like structures which release calcium. And this calcium then removes the inhibition which is there in a relaxed muscle. The inhibition uh, which keeps the muscle relaxed doesn't let these thick filaments react with these thin filaments. Now that inhibition is removed by the calcium, so the interaction begins, and that's how these filaments slide in, and that leads to contraction of the reduction in the length of this unit called the sarcomere. And sarco refers to muscle everywhere. So that leads to a reduction in the length of this, and individual units becoming shorter means the muscle fiber as a whole becoming shorter, muscle fiber as a whole, a large number of muscle fibers as a whole becoming shorter means the muscle as a whole becoming shorter. Sarcolemma, membrane of the muscle cell. Sarcomere, the contractile unit of the muscle. In old age, the person loses muscle, muscles become thinner. Sarcopenia. Penia means shortage. So sarco refers to muscle everywhere. This again shows the sliding filaments, the thin filaments sliding in so that this gap is reduced, and this distance between these two lines, the Z lines, becomes less, and that's what happens in the contracted muscle. Now, this neuromuscular junction, as you can see, is critical for contraction of the muscle. The impulse may come from here, but if it cannot travel across this junction, the muscle will not contract. And if the muscles don't contract, the muscle is essentially paralyzed. So whether we cut the nerve, if we cut the nerve, the muscle will not contract, the muscle will be paralyzed. But if we prevent the transmission of the impulse from the nerve to the muscle across this junction, even then the muscle will be paralyzed. And the paralysis of the muscle doesn't mean just that the person will not be able to move his limbs. The person can also die. So how can the paralysis of skeletal muscles lead to death? Now, this is a question that we were asked in our second year after we had finished the entire course in anatomy and physiology by a professor of pharmacology. Just telling you, I mean, how sometimes when a question is put from another end, instead of holding the nose one way, you hold the nose the other way, it becomes difficult to answer. Not one student could answer this question, that how can paralysis of skeletal muscles lead to death? So we all thought, that paralysis means that the person can't move around when the muscles are not working. Paralysis of skeletal muscles can lead to death because, don't forget, respiratory muscles are also skeletal muscles. So if the respiratory muscles are paralyzed, even then the person can die. That can kill a person. And that's why if we do anything to block the neuromuscular junction, as we do during surgery, particularly abdominal surgery, then the person has to put on a respirator. So it's artificial respiration on which the person is during anesthesia when the muscles have been paralyzed. And why are the muscles paralyzed by the anesthetist? The anesthetist gives that drug which will paralyze the muscles so that the muscles are totally relaxed. Because normally, muscles are always in a state of partial contraction, what we call muscle tone. To relax the muscles completely, the anesthetist gives those drugs which will paralyze the skeletal muscles. But then, since that can lead to death, the person is put on a ventilator during surgery, given artificial breathing through a ventilator. And why do the surgeons want the muscles to be relaxed, particularly abdominal muscles? Because when we are operating on the abdomen, they want the muscles to be flabby. They don't want the muscle to contract and close the opening that they have made using their knife. The surgeon has used a knife to create an opening, but that muscle contraction will try to bring the cut edges closer. The surgeon doesn't want that. He wants the muscle to remain flabby. And that's why these muscles are paralyzed during anesthesia by giving a drug which will block the neuromuscular junction. How can we block the neuromuscular junction? We can block the neuromuscular junction by in many ways. One of the ways it can be done is by giving a chemical which will compete with acetylcholine, which means acts it competes for the same receptors. Acetylcholine will bind to the receptors in this membrane. So there can be substances which bind to these receptors in the same way as acetylcholine does, but do not lead to the biological change of the type that acetylcholine does. Acetylcholine creates an electrical change here, which further leads to contraction. These chemicals which compete with acetylcholine, will block the receptors, will not let acetylcholine attach there because they have greater affinity than acetylcholine for these receptors, but they will not lead to any contraction. So that's how the muscles can get paralyzed. And one such substance which can do so is curare. Curare is found in a large number of plants, and therefore curare can kill. And this has a little sort of interesting asides to it. It has been used by many hunters, particularly in the South American countries, the tribal populations of South America. This has been used as poison on arrowheads. They have discovered those plants which have curare, and those extracts from those plants are applied to the arrowhead so that when they shoot an animal with that, the animal will die quickly. So to kill the animal, they have used this as a poison. They also often use this as a lie detector. The, the belief is that if a person is telling a lie and we give him this substance, curare, the person will die. If he has spoken the truth, God will save him and he will not die. And to some extent, it works. How does it work? Divine intervention apart, let's look at the more rational reason why this quite often works. It's because if a person has told a lie, he knows that since I have told a lie, I'll probably die. So he drinks it very slowly in small bits, and that keeps getting absorbed into the bloodstream, and the person dies. Whereas a person spoken the truth, then he knows that he's confident I will not die. And therefore, he's not hesitant to drink that poison. He drinks it, he gulps it down. When he gulps it down, what it happens is that the irritation produced by the drug makes him vomit. So he vomits it out. Since he vomits it out, not enough is absorbed to kill him. So that's how it works as a lie detector. Another way this neuromuscular junction can be blocked is by inhibiting the release of acetylcholine from here. So instead of competing with it after it has been released, one can stop the release itself. And that is what is done in Botox injections, which are sometimes given for wrinkles these days, because thought that wrinkles are because some facial muscles have contracted, which may be true because stress does lead to contraction of the muscles, particularly the face and the neck muscles and the muscle on the temples. And that also gives headache. But that apart, the wrinkles are partly because of the contraction of the facial muscles. So to relieve those, sometimes these people are using Botox injections. And that acts by paralyzing these muscles But then Botox has to be used in very small quantities because it can be poisonous, as we saw, paralyzing skeletal muscles can be poisonous. So local injections of very small amounts, they can paralyze that part, but not lead to a generalized paralysis leading to death. Now, where do we get this Botox from? It comes from a germ called Clostridium botulinum, and it can grow on canned food. And therefore, canned food which is spoiled should not be consumed. It can have a poison which can kill. And how do we know that canned food has been attacked by germs? These germs also produce gas. So if you find that the lid is bulging, instead of the lid being uh, concave and pointing towards the inside of the can, if the lid is bulging and pointing towards the outside of the can, then chances are gas has been produced inside. This gas has made the lid bulge, and the germs which have grown inside could be as dangerous as Clostridium botulinum. That's why you might have seen that warning on the cans of canned food that do not consume if you find that the lid is bulging. Now, this germ produces botulinum toxin, which blocks the release of acetylcholine, and therefore it can paralyze muscles, can lead to death. But very small quantities are used also for spasm of the eyelids. There's a problem with the eyelids. Some people have what's called blepharospasm. The eyelids go into a spasm and it can be very troublesome. Or in chronic pain, which is due to muscle spasm, and also for wrinkles. So the poison used in very small amounts can sometimes be used as a medicine. There's yet a third way of blocking the neuromuscular junction. Normally what happens is that after acetylcholine has been released here and done its job, it is also promptly removed from here by an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase. So acetylcholine is removed, destroyed, because it should not go on acting all the time. Having done its job, it should be removed so that the person does not have a spasm here, the muscle doesn't go into an unwanted sustained contraction. And one category of substances which do this, that is, they stop the removal of acetylcholine from here, are some insecticides. One type of insecticides do this. They just inhibit the enzyme that destroys acetylcholine after it has been released. That leads to accumulation of acetylcholine. So when too much accumulates, that also leads to paralysis. Now that was about blocking the neuromuscular junction. Let's now see how the force of contraction is regulated. One way could be that we activate a large number of these nerve fibers. You might say, can we make uh, this nerve fiber itself work more strongly or less strongly? Yes, we can. We can by increasing the frequency of stimulation. That is one way. The other way is that we involve a large number of nerve fibers. So these are the two mechanisms used. A large number of nerve fibers would mean a large number of muscle fibers scattered throughout the muscle will contract. And higher frequency of, that is, the rate of these impulses coming from here will mean that all these muscle fibers will contract at a higher rate. Now, suppose the rate of contraction is rate at which the impulse ascent is very low. We don't want a strong contraction, we want a weak contraction. When we want a weak contraction, the frequency with which the impulses come will be low. And the number of nerve fibers involved will also be lower. Now, if each nerve impulse leads to one little twitch in this muscle unit, this muscle fiber, and we have a low frequency, then the muscle, instead of showing a smooth contraction, may show a twitching contraction. But that doesn't happen. Why that doesn't happen is because the frequency may be low in all the nerve fibers which are going to the muscle, but they are not synchronous. And because they are not synchronous, they are not coming at the same time, the muscle contracts weakly, but the contraction is still smooth. So you can see there are two types of languages being used here to regulate the force of contraction. One is the frequency with which it comes. Tuck, 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 like the tuck, 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 tuck. Hmm. Now, the second is have a larger number of nerve cells activated simultaneously so that more motor units throughout the muscle will be involved. So instead of saying a tuck, tuck, large number together. But at the same time, even when it is low frequency and we are having a weak contraction, it is not that the muscle is contracting in a twitchy fashion like this. Tuck, 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 tuck. This coming from a large number of nerve fibers, but not at the same time. Still leads to a tuck, 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 tuck. So the contraction is weak but smooth. So that's how we can regulate the force of contraction. And whether the contraction is weak or strong, it's a smooth contraction. It's not a jerky contraction. Now, this may be also an opportune moment to touch briefly. Uh, this we have seen only the terminal part. But then it's not that just this neuron, as in when we decide, it just starts working and leads to a muscle contraction. That control of willpower is because of the influences coming from the higher regions of the brain, those parts which uh, translate into neuronal activity are willpower. When we decide to contract, impulses start from that part of the brain and come and impinge here. But then it is not only the contraction which is required, we also want to regulate the force of contraction. We want the contraction to be coordinated with in different muscles so that it leads to a proper, meaningful movement. And we also want the contraction to be properly controlled, regulated, and coordinated. Now, all this is the result of the control by the different parts of the brain, which we shall talk a little about in some of the subsequent sessions. So, this cell is not autonomous in itself. It's able to do its job properly and lead to a meaningful movement of a group of muscles only because of the higher influences impinging on these cells in the spinal cord. Now, let's look at what happens on the ground a little more in detail. Uh, say this is the biceps muscle, starting from the shoulder blade, going up to the forearm here. And when it contracts, it takes the forearm up. And if we have a weight here, a load here, then we can lift that load also. But now just look at this. Suppose here are two bones joining at this joint, and you have these two muscles on either side, muscle 1 and muscle 2. Hmm? Now, if muscle 1 contracts the way we saw in case of biceps, when biceps contracts, the arm goes up. Sorry, the forearm goes up towards the arm. Now, when this one contracts, say if this is the forearm, it goes up towards the arm. Hmm? So this is contracted. But then we have a muscle on the other side also, the triceps, say in the case of the arm. Now, when this contracts, this muscle 2 becomes longer. This becomes shorter, and that's what makes the arm move. But then this becomes longer. And for it not to break as a result of this stretching, this will be under stretch. It does not break because it relaxes. So there's a partial contraction in all the muscles all the time that is relaxed. So there is a mechanism which ensures that whenever we decide to contract this muscle to say lift a weight, the same thing, the same mechanism will simultaneously also relax this muscle. How that happens, we'll see one of the subsequent sessions. But you can see that the contraction of one muscle has to be associated with the relaxation of another group of muscles, which lead to an opposite type of movement. For example, when this uh, is taken down, this forearm, say if this is the forearm, this is taken back so that the arm and the forearm become in one straight line once again. So if that has to happen, for that, this has to contract and this has to relax. So this muscle is also needed, but then it leads to an opposite type of movement. Therefore, these two muscles, 1 and 2, are called antagonistic muscles. So when a muscle contracts, its antagonist should relax. This is what has been shown here. Say in the arm, this is the biceps and this is the triceps. Biceps with 1 star and triceps with 2 stars. And since the contraction of these muscles is associated with electrical activity, uh, we can record this electrical activity on the surface. Just as you can record the electrical activity of the heart in the form of an ECG, you can record also the electrical activity of muscles in the form of an EMG. EMG stands for electromyogram, electrical activity of the muscles. So suppose we record the electrical activity of the biceps and the triceps, the EMG of the biceps and the triceps. This is the EMG of the biceps, this is the EMG of the triceps. Now suppose the person moves the forearm up towards the arm. That is the result of the contraction of the biceps. So when the biceps contracts, its electrical activity goes up. Whereas triceps relaxes and its electrical activity goes down. This 1 star corresponds to the biceps again here, 2 stars to the triceps. So this is the biceps electrical activity. This is the electrical activity of the triceps. So when the biceps contracts, its electrical activity goes up, that of triceps goes down. Then when the person brings the arm back, makes the forearm straight, the arm and the forearm in one straight line tries to do that, the triceps contracts and the biceps relaxes, its electrical activity goes down. Now let's look at one more thing. Isometric and isotonic contraction, two types of contraction. Iso means equal. Metric means length. Meter rod, we measure a length with that. So isometric means the length remains the same. Isotonic means the tension remains the same. Here tonic refers to the tone refers to the tension. So tension remains the same. So there are two things which can happen in a muscle. The length can reduce or or the tension can increase. So when a muscle contracts, the length can become shorter and also the tension in the muscle can increase. So it's possible for one of the things to change and the other to remain constant. Isometric, length remains the same. If the length remains the same, there will be no movement. And if you think that no movement means no effort, just try pushing a wall. If you try to push a wall, the wall doesn't move, but the muscles are still contracting. And that's why you can get tired of even pushing a wall, although apparently nothing has been done, because that contraction is entirely isometric. On the other hand, when we lift a weight, the muscle shortens, the tension remains the same, that's isotonic. So here the two types of contraction have been shown. The weight is being lifted, so the muscle has become shorter, so it's isotonic. That is, the tension is equal to the load lifted, that remains constant. The load lifted is constant, so tension is equal to the load lifted. As you can see, the load is further being lifted from here to here to here, and as that happens, this keeps contracting. The tension is equal to this load, length becomes shorter. On the other hand, suppose there's a fixed point here, and this uh, chain hanging from here, the way when you're standing, say, in a bus and holding this. This is a fixed point. You're holding this, but there's no movement. At the same time, you're applying force. So there's no movement. This is isometric. Now, actually, it's not as simple as this, that whenever you lift a weight, the movement is entirely isotonic. And to understand that, let's see this. This lady is trying to lift up this box from here. When she tries to lift up, initially what happens is that the tension starts building up in the muscle. So the tension has started building up, but the box has still not moved. So this contraction is isometric, which means the length remains the same. The tension has started building up. Tension is changing, but since the box has still not moved, there has been no movement. So the length has not changed. Now, when the tension in the muscle just exceeds the weight to be lifted, then the weight actually goes up. Now the tension is equal, the muscle is equal to the box, and remains equal to the box throughout the movement, no matter how much she lifts the weight. But the more she lifts it, the more the length changes. This becomes shorter. Okay. Now, what is the relevance of this? The relevance is that stretch itself can lead to contraction. So when we are doing this, we are not actually lifting the weight, but we are making this tense. We are increasing the tension in the muscle, and that tension leads to contraction. And that's what leads to isometric contraction, which means that the muscle has been primed with activity without actually moving. And then actually it becomes easier to lift it. If we try to lift it with a jerk, we have not given time for the tension to build up slowly to the point which is equal to this box. And that jerky movement can be harmful to the muscle. And that's why a slow and gentle movement is uh, desirable. So slowly let this tension build up within the muscle, which will lead to contraction of the muscle, which will lead to isometric contraction of the muscle, till the tension becomes enough for this box to be lifted up, and then gradually lift the box up. And this is something we do instinctively. Suppose you have to carry a heavy suitcase with a handle. First, you just hold the handle and try to pull on the handle for some time without actually lifting the suitcase. During that period, what is happening is that the tension is building up within those muscles which are required for lifting up the suitcase. The length is not changing because the suitcase has not still been lifted up. But the contraction has still taken place, isometric contraction. And then if you try to lift the suitcase, it will be much easier than if you try to lift it with a jerk. Lifting it with a jerk can even injure the muscle or some associated tendons. So that should be done slowly. And how do we cultivate this habit of doing these things gently and slowly? By doing it the way we do it in yoga asanas. Yoga asanas, we always say, have a conscious movement. When we do it consciously, it will be like this. And in yoga asanas, not only the movement is conscious, it is also slow, gentle, and graceful. So that's why it's much easier to do it without an injury to the muscles. Now, this is one motor unit. Uh, the cell body here and the muscle fibers here. And we've already talked about it, so we need not go into it further. That small motor units means delicate movements are possible. Bigger motor units, as in the limb muscles or belly muscles or gluteal muscles, muscles of the buttocks, those are big motor units. Only strong but crude movements are possible. Now, this we just saw that some partial movement of all the muscles is always there. And that's why the surgeon has to use drugs which will paralyze the muscles to make the muscles relax completely. But we don't always have to use drugs to relax the muscles completely. We can also do it voluntarily. And that's what we do in Shavasana. So when a person is in Shavasana, you find that the electrical activity of, if you record an EMG, is completely silent. This shows the activity in different grades of contraction: weak contraction, a little stronger, very strong contraction. But then it's not completely silent. This EMG can become completely silent as a result of voluntary contraction. And these studies have been done. And we find that through a voluntary effort, by relaxing your muscles completely, as we do in Shavasana, it's possible to achieve a total silence of the EMG. How do we achieve relaxation of effort during a posture? Not just in Shavasana, where we make an voluntary effort to relax, we also achieve relaxation of effort during a posture. That's what Patanjali calls Prayatna Shaithilya. But then, along with Prayatna Shaithilya, what he says is Ananta Samapatti Bhyam. That is, meditate on the eternal, meditate on the divine. So, if you meditate on the divine, which means uh, if you relax the mind completely, it will reflect in the total relaxation of effort, even in the posture. But then physiologically, how is that possible? That becomes possible because the resting length of a muscle is not a fixed entity. That is the length which it has at rest. When we contract it for some effort, it becomes shorter. So we may say that the starting point was the resting length, and after contraction, it is a new length which is shorter. But then what happens is that after we have used the muscle to perform a certain movement, the shorter length, the new shorter length itself becomes the resting length. There's a physiological mechanism that ensures that. And that is why we are able to maintain the posture without effort. And that is further facilitated by relaxation of the mind, which comes by meditating on the divine. So the main thing is relaxing the mind completely. When we do that, then we find that one can achieve relaxation faster, even in a posture, because the muscles which have contracted, for them, the new length has become the resting length. So the resting length is not a fixed entity. Any length which has been maintained for some time can become the resting length. So the contraction of the muscle is needed for performing a movement, not for maintaining the new posture after the movement. And this has a big application. Actually, it helps us understand how is it that a soldier or a watchman can keep standing in attention for a long time. Because if he had to keep those muscles contracted, which are required for maintaining that erect posture all the time, he'll be exhausted very soon. He's able to do it because once he has stood up, suppose he was sitting on a chair. When he stands up, some muscles have to work. Those muscles contract. But if he keeps standing, the muscles which were required for getting up from the chair and standing up, now for those muscles, this new length has become the resting length. And therefore, the muscles are not contracting anymore. Still, the person is erect. So the muscles which were used for getting up are not do not remain in a contracted state. For them, the new length has become the resting length. So that's how it's possible to relax effort also during a posture. Now let's see what is the difference between yoga asanas and physiotherapy. The two look similar at some points. For example, uh, we may say that Bhujangasana is good for management of back pain, and the physiotherapist also gives movements which look somewhat like Bhujangasana. But there's quite a bit of difference between yogic asanas and physiotherapy, and they have been summarized here. Yogic asanas give us a top to toe workout because we are not focusing on a particular part of the body. We want the whole body to be healthy. And even one practice like Surya Namaskar gives us a top to toe workout right from head to foot. Hardly any joint or muscle is spared. So yogic asanas give us a top to toe workout, whereas physiotherapy is focused on the diseased part. In yogic asanas, each posture is only done only once. We hold the posture for some time. In physiotherapy, there is repetitive movement. We don't hold the posture. In yoga asanas, we hold the posture. In physiotherapy, we don't. The priorities in yoga asanas are first relaxation, and second priority next to it is flexibility. Any improvement in strength is incidental, whereas in physiotherapy, the priorities are flexibility and strengthening of the muscles. And therefore, the two can complement each other. Not only yoga asana, gym practices can also uh, be complemented by the yogic asanas because unless the muscle is relaxed, it can't be fully flexible. If we try to bend a muscle which is taut, which is tense, it is more likely to break. So relaxation is ability to relax is important, and therefore the two can complement each other, whether it's yogic asanas in gym or yogic asanas in physiotherapy. So here the priorities are more. The first is flexibility, and the second is strengthening of the muscles. And how is the strengthening of muscles achieved? By making the muscles work against resistance. So you might have seen different types of loads, and the load keeps increasing as the person's muscles become stronger. When the load increases, the muscle gets still stronger because the general principle is that if you use something more, it becomes stronger. So if you use it for greater weights, you use it more frequently, the muscle becomes stronger. Yoga asanas are relaxing. At the end of the session, this person is relaxed, whereas physiotherapy can be tiring and sometimes even painful because if some particular part has to be restored, then sometimes a movement has also to be done in spite of some pain. Some pain also has to be tolerated. In yogic asanas, no equipment is required. whereas in physiotherapy, many types of equipment is required, all types of heating pads, ultrasound machines, ultrasonics, which deliver ultrasonic waves, or various types of chains and pulleys, and so on. So, all equipment, proper physiotherapy, by and large, some equipment is absolutely essential. If nothing else, at least heating and cooling pads. Whereas in yoga asanas, strictly speaking, no equipment is required, although sometimes one may improvise some props, as you have seen in some of the classes. Yoga asanas are part of a discipline which was designed primarily for spiritual growth, and the asanas are that part of it which help improve the function of the body and to some extent also the mind, so that these two basic tools that we have, the body and the mind, they can function better. If they function better, then our rest of the sadhana in yoga can also be better. Because no matter what type of life we live, even if it's a yogic life, we use these basic instruments, the body and the mind, and to improve their function, we use practices like asanas and pranayamas and meditation. So these are techniques for improving the function of our tools so that we can engage in those aspects of the sadhana which will lead to spiritual growth. So yoga asanas are part of a discipline which has been designed primarily for spiritual growth, whereas physiotherapy is part of disciplines which have been designed for management of disease, particularly disciplines such as orthopedics and neurology. So it's a part of those disciplines which have been designed primarily for management of disease of the bones and joints, diseases of the nervous system. So this is not a system designed for spiritual growth, although it can be used that way. That is different. That is an individual sort of ingenuity and understanding of the process of yoga. Movement, in fact, is a basic mechanism of life, and it has been conserved throughout evolution. And why I'm saying so is you'll be surprised that at the neuromuscular junction, when I said that as a result of this nerve impulse coming from here, the acetylcholine vesicles move closer to the membrane of the nerve cell itself. They move closer to the boundary that separates the nerve cell from the muscle cell. They first move closer to the boundary and then they are released outside. Now, how does this movement of these balloons take place? These vesicles, these little tiny balloons containing it, how does it take place? How do they move closer to the boundary? Using the same type of proteins like actin and myosin, they move there. So, not only the muscle as a whole, but even the movement of these tiny balloons within the nerve cell uses the same type of proteins which we use in the muscle as a whole. This is the type of proteins which an amoeba, a single celled organism, also uses to change its shape. When it finds that there is something like food available, it throws its arms around it. Throw its arms to produce those arms and throw the arms around the food. Again, it uses the same mechanism to change its shape, which and to move towards the food, which is used by us in these proteins like actin and myosin. So, actin and myosin, like proteins, have been used by single celled organisms. They, we have seen in the respiratory system that there are tiny hair on the cells of the respiratory tract which keep moving the fluid in these, the mucus, up so that it doesn't go to the lungs. Now, these tiny hair-like cells on the tiny hair-like projections on the cells, the cilia, they also move as a result of the activity of the same type of proteins as actin and myosin. So these proteins have been used by the single-celled organisms like amoeba to change their shape. They have been used for moving these vesicles containing acetylcholine towards the boundary, and they have been used also for this. And what? Not only these proteins, how these proteins are activated, that mechanism we saw is by converting this electrical language into chemical language, the release of calcium at this point. That also is common to all these. This movement takes place because of calcium. The amoeba moves, uses those proteins. There's proteins in the amoeba get activated for changing its shape as a result of calcium. And the cilia move in the respiratory tract. Again, when the electrical activity uses calcium to activate these proteins, which in turn lead to movement of the cilia, which push the fluid up so that it doesn't go into the lungs. And it is the same that happens in big fat muscles. In tiny units of these big fat muscles, electrical impulses dipping down, releasing chemicals, activating the same set of proteins which came up at the beginning of life. It happens not only in animals, but also in plants, because plants may not move as a whole, but plants also need movement of this type. They also need their release of chemicals within themselves, for which this type of balloons have to burst. A little movement is required also for the plant to be able to turn itself towards the sun, and so on. So all those movements also employ similar mechanisms. So these are mechanisms which have been conserved through evolution. Once the master craftsman designed something which can give us movement, only a little bit of tinkering has been done to suit individual requirements, but basically the mechanism has remained the same. So while the master craftsman has been very innovative, which is very obvious through the diversity, it has also been very conservative. So to achieve this mixture of innovation and conservation, apparent contradictions is another thing which we can learn from that master craftsman, the divine. Both are important. It's important to be innovative and creative. It's also important sometimes to be conservative, not to throw something good away. And that is something which is really remarkable. So all contraries can be reconciled in that one who is everything and who knows all. So this basic dictum that when a change is not necessary, it is necessary not to change has been followed. And yet, so much change has taken place over the course of evolution, and it is still underway. More evolution, greater change, a change of consciousness which will change the very human nature. That is the vision of Sri Aurobindo and the mother. So you can see how conservation and innovation, which is at the root of evolution, has been reconciled in the one who knows no contradiction. Let me end with a quote from the mother on conscious movement, which we learn through asanas, but we should spill over into daily life. All the movements you make when dressing, taking your bath, tidying your room, make them consciously. Going up and down the stairs, go up with the consciousness of all muscles which are working and of making them work harmoniously. If we let the conscious movement of the asana spill over into daily life, we will be able to appreciate the divine, the ingenuity of the divine at every step, and also avoid accidents. Because most accidents are not accidental. It happens because we are climbing the stairs, but actually thinking of something else. Suggested reading: this popular book, The Human Machine, these two textbooks, Fundamentals of Physiology, and a bigger one, Understanding Medical Physiology. Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch is now open to all of you, has resumed its activities now that COVID is gone, and you're all welcome here. We love to hear from you. Please feel free to write to us your questions or comments on yes@yesspirituality.com. Gratitude to the Mother and Sri Aurobindo for making these sessions possible. And thank you all for being there.
Maybe we can close today's session with a moment of silence. Thank you, everyone.